At 72 years old, Margaret Whitlock owned exactly four things: a cardigan the color of weak tea, a pair of orthopedic shoes that had walked her through her husband's funeral 2 winters ago, a small wooden box containing her mother's wedding ring, and a single brass key on a faded blue ribbon. Her sons had taken everything else. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The house she'd raised them in, the Buick that still smelled faintly of her husband's pipe tobacco, the pension Frank had spent 41 years earning at the rail yard. Gone. Signed away on documents she didn't fully understand, in an attorney's office that smelled of stale coffee and lemon polish. Her oldest son Donald had slid a pen across the desk and told her it was just paperwork, just a formality, just for tax reasons, just to protect her. She had signed because she was tired, because Frank had been dead for 14 months, because her hands shook now in a way they hadn't before, and because the boys were her boys, and you trusted your children. That was what mothers did. 3 weeks later, Donald and his younger brother Michael came to the house with a moving van and a list. They told her she would be more comfortable in a small apartment in Hartford, closer to medical care, closer to them. They told her the old house was too big, too full of stairs, too dangerous for a woman alone. They told her they were doing this for her own good. They packed up her life in 17 brown boxes, and they sold the house at the end of the month for $192,000, and she never saw a cent of it. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a beige building on Asylum Avenue. Margaret hated the name of the street from the first day. The elevator broke twice in the first month, and the hallway smelled of cooking grease and disinfectant, and the window in the bedroom looked out at the brick wall of the building next door. Donald paid the rent. Michael handled the utilities. Neither of them visited more than once every 6 weeks, and when they did, they checked their watches twice and left before the coffee finished brewing. The pension came in monthly, deposited into an account that had Donald's name on it, as well as hers. He called it a joint account, said it was simpler that way, said he could help manage things since her eyes weren't what they used to be. She didn't argue. Her eyes were fine. Her mind was fine. But arguing felt like more than she had in her, those first months. She watched the money come in and watched her access to it shrink, and she said nothing, and she made do with the small amounts Donald transferred to her own private account every Friday like an allowance. Frank would have known what to do. Frank had been the one who handled the bank, the one who balanced the checkbook on Sunday afternoons at the kitchen table with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. Margaret had been the one who kept the household running, who raised the boys, who cooked the meals and ironed the shirts and remembered every birthday and anniversary on both sides of the family. They had been a team for 46 years, and when Frank died of a stroke in the upstairs bathroom on a Tuesday morning in February, the team was gone, and Margaret discovered that she had forgotten how to be a single player. The boys had been good once. She held on to that. Donald had been a serious child who liked to organize his crayons by color and check the locks on the doors at night. Michael had been the funny one, the one who made his father laugh at the dinner table, the one who brought home stray cats and tried to hide them in the garage. Somewhere along the way, both of them had become the kind of men who wore expensive watches and looked at their phones during conversations. Somewhere along the way, they had stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as a problem to be managed. Margaret didn't know when the shift had happened. She only knew that by the time Frank died, the shift was complete, and she was alone in a way that included being alone in a room full of her own children. She thought sometimes about the small wooden box and the brass key on the faded blue ribbon. She kept them in the bottom drawer of the nightstand in the apartment, wrapped in a cotton handkerchief that had been her mother's. The boys didn't know about the box. They didn't know about the key. They had never asked, and she had never offered, and the silence between what they knew and what she knew had been a small, private comfort to her in the months since Frank's death. The box held her mother's wedding ring, a thin gold band with a tiny chip of diamond that her father had bought during the Depression on a railroad worker's salary. The key was older than the ring. The key was the only thing Margaret had left from her mother's side of the family that wasn't a photograph or a memory, and it opened a door she hadn't seen in 38 years. The cottage. The small, weathered, salt-stained cottage on a strip of coast in Maine where her mother had been born and where her grandmother had lived until she died in the summer of 1971. Margaret had spent every summer of her childhood in that cottage. She had learned to swim in the cold gray water off the rocks behind the house. She had learned to identify gulls by their cries, and to dig clams from the mud flats at low tide, and to know when a storm was coming by the way the air went thick and metallic before the rain. The cottage had been her grandmother Adelia's, and when Adelia died, the cottage had passed to Margaret's mother Lillian, and when Lillian died in 1986, the cottage had passed to Margaret. She had not been back since the funeral. Frank had not liked the ocean. Frank had been a man of fields and rivers and Sunday morning church services, and the long drive up to Maine had never appealed to him. And Margaret had let the cottage become a memory, because letting it become a memory was easier than the conversations about going there. She had paid the property taxes every year out of her own small savings, a check written in November, mailed to the town clerk's office in a place called Stonecross Harbor. The amount was small. The land was rocky and unimproved, and the structure was old, and the assessment had stayed low for as long as she had been paying it. She had never told Donald or Michael about the cottage. She had never quite been able to say why. Some instinct, some quiet voice, had told her to keep it to herself, and she had listened to that voice even when she had not understood it. Now, sitting in the beige apartment on Asylum Avenue on a Wednesday afternoon in October, she understood it perfectly. Donald had come by that morning with a folder of papers. He had spread them on her kitchen table and explained in the slow, careful voice he used for her now that there were some additional matters to clean up. Power of attorney needed to be updated. The pension account needed to be restructured. The car, the one Donald and Michael had taken when they moved her out of the house, would be sold next month, and the proceeds would be deposited into the joint account for her care. He used that phrase 3 times. For her care. Margaret listened and signed nothing. She told Donald she needed to think about it. She told him she would call him on Friday. Donald looked at her with the particular impatience of a man who was used to being deferred to, and he gathered up his papers, and he told her not to take too long, because these things had a way of becoming complicated if they sat. After he left, Margaret sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She made herself a cup of tea. She drank it slowly. She watched the steam rise from the cup and disappear into the air of an apartment she had never wanted, in a building she had never chosen, in a city that had never been hers. And she thought about the cottage. She thought about it in a way she had not let herself think about it in nearly 4 decades. She thought about the smell of the salt air and the sound of the gulls and the rough warmth of the kitchen floor under her bare feet on summer mornings when she was 8 years old. She thought about her grandmother Adelia standing at the stove in a faded blue apron, stirring something in a pot, humming a song with no words. She thought about her mother sitting on the porch in the evening with a cup of tea and a quilt across her knees, watching the light go down over the water. She thought about the key in the bottom drawer of the nightstand. That night, Margaret did not sleep. She lay in the bed in the small bedroom in the apartment she hated, and she watched the ceiling, and she thought about what it would mean to leave. She was 72 years old. She had no car. She had $341 in her private account. She had a Social Security check that came on the 3rd of every month, deposited into an account Donald would notice if she touched. She had a son who would come looking for her, not out of love, but out of inconvenience, because a missing mother was a complication, and Donald did not tolerate complications. But she had a cottage. She had a key. She had a deed somewhere in a fireproof box at her bank, a deed that bore her name and her name only, a deed that Donald and Michael had never seen because they had never thought to ask, and she had never thought to tell. She had a place that was hers, that had always been hers, that no piece of paperwork in an attorney's office in Hartford could undo. She had paid the taxes every November for 38 years on a property neither of her sons knew existed. The cottage was the one thing they had not taken, because the cottage was the one thing they had not known to take. She got out of bed at 4 in the morning and made coffee. She drank it standing at the window, looking out at the brick wall of the building next door, and she made her plan. It was not a sophisticated plan. It did not require sophistication. She would go to the bank when it opened at 9. She would withdraw $300 in cash, leaving $41 in the account so nothing would look unusual. She would walk to the bus station. She would buy a ticket to Portland, Maine, and from Portland, she would find her way to Stonecross Harbor, however that needed to happen. She would take the small wooden box, and the cardigan, and the orthopedic shoes, and the key on the faded blue ribbon, and she would leave the apartment on Asylum Avenue, and she would not call Donald, and she would not call Michael, and she would not tell anyone where she was going. She packed her things into a canvas tote bag she had bought at a craft fair 3 years ago, the one with the pattern of small blue birds along the bottom. Everything she wanted to take with her fit into that single bag. She left behind the furniture the boys had picked out, the curtains they had chosen, the small framed prints they had hung on the walls in places they thought looked nice. She left behind the framed photograph of Donald's family that he had given her for Christmas, the one she had set on the side table because he expected to see it when he visited. She left behind the television she never watched, and the microwave she never used, and the answering machine that only ever held messages from Donald telling her things he had already decided. She wrote no note. She owed them no note. The bus left Hartford at 10:15 in the morning, and Margaret Whitlock was on it, with a canvas bag and a brass key and an amount of resolve she had forgotten she possessed. She sat by the window on the right side of the bus, the side that would face east as they traveled north, and she watched the city give way to suburbs, and the suburbs give way to small towns, and the small towns give way to woods. She watched the leaves turn from green to gold to red and back to green again as they passed through different microclimates. And she thought about her grandmother Adelia, and she thought about her mother Lillian, and she thought about the cottage by the sea that had been waiting for her for 38 years without her quite understanding that it was waiting. The bus arrived in Portland at 4:30 in the afternoon. Margaret had never been to Portland alone. She had never been to Portland at all, in fact. Her summers at the cottage had always involved her father driving them up from Connecticut, the old Plymouth station wagon loaded with suitcases and beach towels and a cooler of sandwiches Lillian had made the night before. Margaret had no memory of how exactly one got from Portland to Stonecross Harbor. She knew it was north of Portland, along the coast, perhaps an hour and a half in good traffic. She also knew that there was no good traffic in October on the Maine coast, because there was no traffic at all, because the summer people had gone home and the year-round people were busy with whatever year-round people did to prepare for winter. She asked at the bus station counter. A young woman with a nose ring and a kind expression looked up Stonecross Harbor on her computer and told Margaret that there was a regional bus that ran twice a day to the small towns up the coast, but the last one had already left, and the next one wasn't until 7 the next morning. Margaret thanked her. She walked outside into the late afternoon light and stood on the sidewalk with her canvas bag and considered her options. She had $297 left after the bus ticket. A hotel in Portland would take a significant portion of that. A taxi to Stonecross Harbor would take all of it. She did not have a smartphone. She did not have a way to call an Uber. She did not have anyone she could call who would come and get her, because the only people who would come and get her were the people she was running from. She walked, not to the cottage. She walked because she needed to move, because standing on the sidewalk felt like a kind of paralysis she could not afford. She walked through the streets of Portland with her canvas bag over her shoulder, and she looked at the brick buildings and the small shops and the harbor visible at the bottom of the hill, and she felt something she had not felt in many years. She felt like a person who was deciding things. She felt like a person whose next move was hers alone. She found a small diner on a side street near the water. It was the kind of place that had been there a long time, with vinyl booths and a counter and a woman behind the counter who looked up when Margaret walked in and gave her the assessing glance of someone who had been pouring coffee for strangers for several decades and knew the difference between a tourist and someone who needed help. Margaret sat at the counter. She ordered a cup of coffee and a grilled cheese sandwich, the cheapest things on the menu. The woman, whose name tag read Cora, poured the coffee and slid the cup across the counter and stood for a moment looking at Margaret with an expression Margaret recognized from her own years of teaching Sunday school. It was the look of someone deciding whether to ask. "You all right, hon?" Cora finally said. "I'm trying to get to Stonecross Harbor," Margaret said. "The bus doesn't go until morning." Cora nodded slowly. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the same pot. She leaned her elbow on the counter. "My cousin Pete drives a tow truck up that way," Cora said. "Lives in Brunswick. He's usually heading home around 6. I could call him." Margaret felt her throat tighten in a way she had not anticipated. She had not expected kindness. She had not factored kindness into her plan. She had factored hardship and difficulty and the cold mechanics of survival on a fixed amount of money, but she had not factored a woman named Cora in a diner in Portland, Maine, who would offer to call her cousin Pete out of nothing but the recognition of need. "I would pay him," Margaret said, "for the gas." "Pete won't take money from a lady your age trying to get home," Cora said. But you can buy yourself another cup of coffee while we wait. Pete arrived at 6:15. He was a large man in his late 50s with a beard and a Carhartt jacket and the same kind of straightforward steadiness his cousin had. He looked at Margaret's canvas bag and at her face and asked no questions. He drove her north along Route 1 in his tow truck, the cab warm and smelling of diesel and old coffee, and he talked easily about the weather and the season and the small towns they passed through. He did not ask her why she was going to Stonecross Harbor. He did not ask her if anyone was expecting her. He did not ask her if she had somewhere to stay. When they reached the turnoff for the harbor road, the sun had already gone down. Pete drove slowly along the narrow paved road that wound past stone walls and stands of pine trees and the occasional house set back from the road, lit from within by lamps that suggested the warmth of people sitting down to dinner. Margaret watched the houses with the particular attention of someone who was about to discover whether her own destination still existed. "Where exactly we headed, ma'am?" Pete asked as they came into the small village of Stonecross Harbor. The village was 4 streets and a post office and a general store and a church and a harbor with maybe 40 boats moored for the winter. Margaret had not seen it in 38 years, and it had not changed in any way that mattered. "The cottage is north of town," she said. "Out on the point. There's a dirt road that goes off to the right after the second stone wall past the cemetery. The cottage is at the end of it." Pete nodded. He drove slowly. The dirt road was still there. The stone walls were still there. The cemetery, with its old slate headstones leaning in the late October dark, was still there. Pete turned the tow truck onto the dirt road and drove carefully, the headlights catching the trunks of pine trees and the occasional flash of a deer's eyes from the undergrowth. And after perhaps a quarter mile, the trees opened up and the road ended in a small clearing, and there it was. The cottage stood at the edge of the rocks, 20 feet from where the land dropped down to the ocean. It was smaller than Margaret remembered, the way places from childhood always are. The cedar shingles had weathered to the color of old silver. The roof had a slight sag in the middle, but the chimney still stood straight, and the windows were all still in their frames, and the door was still painted the deep blue that her grandmother had painted it the summer before she died. Pete cut the engine. The sound of the ocean came in through the open window of the cab, the soft, sustained rush of waves against rock, and Margaret sat very still and listened to a sound she had not heard in 38 years, and something inside her, something that had been clenched tight for 14 months, began to unclench. "This your place?" Pete asked quietly. "It is," Margaret said. He helped her out of the truck. He walked her to the front door, his flashlight cutting a path through the dark. The brass key on the faded blue ribbon was in her coat pocket, and she took it out, and her hand was steady, which surprised her. She fitted the key into the lock. The lock was stiff with 38 years of disuse and salt air, and for a moment she thought it would not turn. Then she felt the tumblers shift, slowly, almost reluctantly, and the bolt slid back, and the door opened on hinges that creaked but held. Pete waited at the threshold. He did not come in. He shone his flashlight into the front room, and Margaret saw, in the long pale beam, a small parlor with a stone fireplace, 2 armchairs draped in old white sheets, a wooden trunk against the far wall, and a layer of fine gray dust over everything. "You got someone you can call if you need anything?" Pete asked. Margaret thought about the question. She thought about the truth of it, which was no. She thought about what she could say that would be honest without being pitiful. "I'll be all right," she said. "Thank you, Pete. Thank you more than I can say." He nodded. He handed her his flashlight, and she tried to refuse, and he insisted. He told her his cousin Cora had his number at the diner, and if Margaret ever needed anything, she should call. He got back in the tow truck and drove slowly back down the dirt road, and the red of his taillights disappeared around the curve of pine trees, and Margaret Whitlock stood alone in the doorway of her grandmother's cottage on the coast of Maine on a Wednesday night in October, with a canvas bag over her shoulder and a flashlight in her hand, and the sound of the ocean behind her. She stepped inside. The cottage held its breath around her. The air was cold and still and carried the particular smell of a closed wooden building near the sea, salt and cedar, and something faintly floral that might have been the last ghost of her grandmother's lavender sachets, the ones Adelia had tucked into every drawer and closet to keep moths away. Margaret moved slowly through the front room, her flashlight beam catching the corners. The 2 armchairs under the sheets had been her grandmother's, then her mother's, and they were still where Margaret remembered them. angled toward the fireplace. The wooden trunk against the far wall had been her grandfather's sea chest, brought home from his last voyage as a merchant marine in 1948. The kitchen was through a doorway to the left. Margaret walked into it and stood for a moment, breathing. The old cast-iron stove was still there against the back wall, cold and dark and patient. The hand pump at the sink was still there, the long curved handle reaching up like the neck of a brass swan. The small wooden table was still there, the one her grandmother had set with 3 blue plates every morning of every summer of Margaret's childhood. There were 2 chairs. There had been 3 when Margaret was a girl. She did not know what had happened to the third. She set her canvas bag on the table. She set the flashlight on the table beside it, pointed at the ceiling, so the light filled the room with a soft reflected glow rather than the hard direct beam. She took off her coat. She hung it on the hook beside the back door, the hook where her grandmother had always hung her own coat, and the simple act of putting her coat on that hook produced in Margaret a feeling so unexpected she had to sit down. She sat in one of the wooden chairs at the table. She put her hands flat on the surface of the wood. The table was solid maple, 3 inches thick, made by her great-grandfather Ezra in 1903 according to family lore. Margaret had never been able to verify the lore, but she had no reason to doubt it. The table felt like something that had been made by someone who intended it to last. She was 72 years old, and she was alone in a cold cottage with no electricity and no water running from the pump until she primed it, and no food beyond a packet of crackers she had bought at the bus station, and the temperature outside was dropping into the 40s, and her sons did not know where she was, and no one was coming to help her. She had never been happier. She did not understand the feeling at first. It arrived without permission, and it did not match the practical facts of her circumstances, and she sat with it for a long time, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you find on the beach to see what's underneath. The feeling did not fade. It settled. It was not happiness in the way she had understood happiness when Frank was alive, the comfortable contentment of a life that fit. It was something fiercer and more elemental. It was the feeling of belonging to herself again. She would understand later that this was the feeling her grandmother Adelia had carried in her hands every summer of Margaret's childhood. The feeling of a woman who had been left a piece of land and a small wooden house and a stretch of coastline, and who had said to the world, "This is mine, and I will tend it, and I will not apologize for tending it." Adelia had been widowed at 46. She had raised Lillian alone on a school teacher's pension and the small income from renting the cottage out for 2 weeks every August to summer people from Boston. She had lived in this cottage year-round, through winters that froze the harbor solid, and she had never once spoken of being lonely, because she had not been lonely. She had been by herself, which was a different thing, and the difference was the kind of thing Margaret was only now, at 72, beginning to fully understand. She got up from the table. She found the box of long wooden matches her grandmother had always kept in the drawer beside the sink, and the matches were still there, still dry, the box faded but intact. She found the kindling stacked in the wood box beside the stove, and the kindling was dry too, because the cottage was tight, and the chimney drew well, and 38 years of stillness had not been enough to bring the damp inside. She laid a fire in the kitchen stove the way her grandmother had taught her when she was 9 years old, the way her mother had taught her when she was a teenager, the way she had not done in 40 years, but her hands remembered. The fire caught on the second match. The kindling crackled, and the small flame grew into a larger flame, and Margaret added 2 split logs from the wood box, and the iron of the stove began to tick as it warmed, and within 20 minutes, the kitchen was no longer cold. She primed the hand pump with water from a small jug her grandmother had always kept beside it for that purpose, and after 18 strokes of the handle, the water came up clear and cold, smelling of stone and iron, and Margaret filled the kettle and set it on the stove. She made tea from a tin she found in the cupboard, the leaves probably older than her grandson's, but still aromatic when the boiling water hit them. She sat at the table with the cup of tea between her hands, and she let the warmth of it travel up her arms into her chest, and she looked around the kitchen at the shelves of her grandmother's dishes and the row of jars on the windowsill and the cast-iron pan hanging from the hook above the stove, and she thought about how strange it was that her sons had taken so much and had left so much more. They had taken the house in Hartford and the car and the pension. They had taken her name off the deed of the only home she had shared with Frank, and they had moved her into an apartment she did not want, and they had treated her like a problem they were solving. They had assumed that what they took was everything, because they had never bothered to learn what she had. They had not asked about her grandmother. They had not asked about the cottage. They had not asked about the summer she had spent as a child digging clams in the mud flats and identifying gulls and learning to swim in the cold gray water off the rocks. They had taken inventory of her life, and they had missed everything that mattered. The wooden trunk in the front room. She thought about it as she drank her tea. Her grandfather's sea chest. She had not opened it in 40 years. She did not know what was in it. Her mother had mentioned it once, near the end, lying in the hospital bed in the small room in the Hartford Convalescent Center where she spent her last 6 weeks. Lillian had been on the morphine by then, and her conversation had drifted, and she had said something Margaret had not understood at the time. "There's a chest in the cottage," Lillian had said. "Your grandfather brought it home from sea. Your grandmother kept things in it. Things she didn't talk about. You should look in it someday, Margaret. When you're ready." Margaret had nodded and held her mother's hand and not pressed for more details, because Lillian had been tired and the morphine had made conversations hard, and there had been 100 other things they were trying to say to each other before the time ran out. The chest had stayed in Margaret's mind as one of those unfinished conversations, the kind every person carries with them after a parent dies, the questions that did not get asked and never could be. She finished her tea. She washed the cup in the sink and dried it with a linen towel that smelled of cedar. She took the flashlight from the table, and she walked back into the front room, and she stood in front of the wooden trunk. It was a sea chest in the old style, perhaps 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, made of dark oak with brass fittings that had gone green with verdigris. The lid was secured with 2 iron clasps, and there was a keyhole in the front face of the trunk, surrounded by a brass plate engraved with the name Captain Josiah Brackett, 1887. Margaret knelt in front of the chest. Her knees protested. She ignored them. She tried the clasps, and they opened. The keyhole, she expected, would require a key she did not have. She tried lifting the lid anyway, and the lid lifted, and she realized the chest had been left unlocked, perhaps by her grandmother on the last day Adelia had been able to come down to this room, perhaps by her mother on the day of the funeral when Lillian had come up to the cottage for one last visit before driving back to Connecticut for the final time. The chest opened. The smell that came out was cedar and old paper and something faintly metallic. Margaret shone the flashlight into the interior. What she saw made her sit back on her heels and put one hand against the floor to steady herself. The chest was full. Not with junk, not with old clothes or moth-eaten linens. The chest was full of objects that, even in the rough beam of a borrowed flashlight, even with the dust of decades laying soft over their surfaces, were clearly not ordinary objects. There were leather-bound ledgers, perhaps a dozen of them, stacked neatly along one side. There was a wooden case the size of a large book that, when she carefully lifted it out, proved to contain a brass sextant nested in faded green velvet, the kind of instrument a ship's captain would have used to navigate by the stars. There was a smaller wooden box, lacquered black, with a Chinese character carved into the lid. There was a bundle of envelopes tied with a red ribbon, the paper yellowed but the ribbon still bright. There was a velvet pouch, drawn closed with a silk cord, that was heavier in her hand than she expected when she lifted it. She did not open the velvet pouch. Not yet. She set it carefully on the floor beside her. She lifted out one of the leather-bound ledgers and opened it. The first page bore an inscription in fine spidery handwriting. Personal accounts and records of Captain Josiah Brackett, Master, Merchant Vessel Adelia, commenced this day, the 3rd of April, 1891. The ship had been named for her grandmother. Her grandmother, who had been born in 1893. The ship had been named for her grandmother 2 years before her grandmother had been born. Margaret stared at the inscription, and she understood, slowly, that the Adelia who had given her name to a merchant vessel in 1891 was not her grandmother. The Adelia who had given her name to a merchant vessel in 1891 was someone older. A great-grandmother, perhaps. A great-great-grandmother. A woman in this family whose name had been carried forward across generations because she had mattered enough to be carried forward. Margaret turned the page. The ledger was a record of voyages, cargo manifests, port fees, crew wages, expenses for provisions and repairs. Captain Josiah Brackett had sailed the Adelia from Maine to the Caribbean and back, from Maine to the coast of Africa and back, from Maine around the Horn to the ports of the Pacific and back. The voyages were recorded in detail. The cargoes were varied. The captain had been a careful man, and his ledgers were the work of someone who understood that records mattered, that what was written down would outlive the writer, that the future would want to know what the past had carried. Margaret turned to the back of the ledger. She did not know yet what she was looking for. She was simply turning pages, allowing the document to reveal itself to her in the way old documents do, in their own time and on their own terms. The back pages were different from the front. The front had been voyages and cargo. The back was something else. The back was a personal inventory, a list, written in the captain's same fine hand, of items the captain had brought home over the course of his career and stored in this very chest, in this very cottage, against the day when his daughter or his granddaughter or his great-granddaughter might have need of them. The list went on for 4 pages. Margaret read it slowly, holding the flashlight in one hand and the ledger in the other, and as she read, her hands began to shake, and then her hands stopped shaking because something in her had settled past the point where shaking was the right response. She was looking at an inventory of objects the captain had collected from 40 years of merchant voyages in the late 19th century. Items from China and Japan and the Ottoman Empire and the West Indies and the gold ports of California. Items he had purchased and items he had been given and items he had won at cards and port taverns from Singapore to Shanghai to San Francisco. She did not know what any of it was worth. She did not know enough about the world of such objects to even hazard a guess. But she knew, looking at the list, that her grandfather Josiah Brackett had spent 40 years bringing things home to this cottage, and her great-grandmother Adelia had stored them in this chest, and her grandmother Adelia, named for her grandmother, had kept the chest closed and unmentioned through her own long life, and her mother Lillian had mentioned it only once, on her deathbed, in a sentence Margaret had not understood. And Donald and Michael had taken the house in Hartford and the car and the pension, and they had never thought to ask about the coastal cottage their mother had inherited from her mother, who had inherited it from her mother. They had never thought to ask about the wooden chest in the front room. They had never thought to ask what their family had been before it had been them. Margaret closed the ledger. She set it carefully on top of the others. She lifted the velvet pouch from where she had placed it on the floor beside her, and she felt its weight in her hand, and she did not open it yet, because she understood that what she did next was important, and she wanted to be ready before she did it. She carried the flashlight back to the kitchen. She set it on the table, beam up, and she sat down in the chair, and she put her hands flat on the maple wood that her great-great-grandfather Ezra had made in 1903, and she breathed slowly in and slowly out, and she let herself understand, in the particular way that understanding arrives when you finally have time and space and stillness to let it in, what had just happened. She had walked away from a beige apartment on Asylum Avenue with a canvas bag and $297. She had ridden a bus to Portland and a tow truck up the coast, and she had let herself into a cottage that had been closed for 38 years, and she had built a fire and made a cup of tea and opened a chest, and what she had found inside the chest was not just an inheritance. What she had found inside the chest was a corrective, a correction to the story her sons had been telling her about who she was and what she had and what she was worth. The story they had told her, the one she had let herself believe in the months after Frank died, was that she was a woman who needed to be managed. A woman whose decisions could not be trusted. A woman whose life had ended when her husband's life ended, and what came after was a slow, careful winding down toward the convenient conclusion of placement in a facility somewhere. That story was wrong. The chest in the front room was the proof that the story was wrong. The chest was the record of a family that had been navigating oceans for 130 years, and Margaret Whitlock was the current keeper of that record, and her sons had not known to ask about it because they had not seen her clearly enough to know there were questions worth asking. She was going to keep the cottage. She was going to keep the chest. She was going to figure out, slowly and carefully, what was in the velvet pouch, and what was in the lacquered black box, and what was written in the bundle of letters tied with the red ribbon. She was going to understand her family in a way she had not understood it before. And then she was going to decide what came next, on her own terms, in her own time, without consulting Donald, and without consulting Michael, and without signing any more documents in any more attorneys' offices that smelled of stale coffee and lemon polish. The fire in the stove popped. A log shifted. The sound of the ocean came through the closed kitchen window, the soft, sustained breathing of the Atlantic against the rocks of the point, the same sound her grandmother had heard every night of her life from this same room. Margaret got up. She took the flashlight, and she walked back into the front room, and she knelt again in front of the open chest, and she reached for the velvet pouch. The cord was silk, faded to the color of weak rose tea, and it untied easily under her fingers. The mouth of the pouch was small, and what slid out into her palm was small as well, but small in the way that important things are often small. 3 objects. The first was a coin. Gold, heavy for its size, with markings that Margaret could not read in the flashlight beam, but that were clearly not English and clearly not modern. The second was a ring. A man's ring, broad and thick, set with a single dark red stone the size of a thumbnail, the gold of the band scrolled with engraving that had been worn soft by handling. The third was a small flat object wrapped in tissue paper, which Margaret unfolded carefully, and inside the tissue paper was a brooch. Gold filigree in the shape of a flower. At its center, a pale green stone that caught the flashlight beam and threw it back in a way that made Margaret stop breathing for a moment. She did not know the names of stones. She did not know how to tell jade from emerald from glass. She knew only that the stone in the center of the brooch was not glass. The way it held the light, the way the light moved inside it, that was not the behavior of glass. She set the 3 objects on the floor beside the chest. She covered them with the tissue paper. She wrapped the tissue paper in her handkerchief, and she sat back on her heels, and she looked at the chest, and she understood that she was going to need help. Not the kind of help her sons had been offering. Not the kind that came with paperwork and conditions and a slow erosion of her own agency. A different kind of help. The kind that a person sought out deliberately, on her own terms, from people she chose. She closed the chest. She did not lock it, because she did not have the key, but she lowered the lid carefully and pressed the brass clasps back into place. She lifted the wrapped objects from the floor and carried them into the kitchen and set them on the table beside the flashlight. She made herself another cup of tea, because the first cup was long cold, and she sat down again and looked at the small bundle of tissue paper on the table beside her, and she let herself think. The first thing she needed was sleep. The journey had been long, and her body was past the point where it could be persuaded to continue indefinitely. The second thing she needed was a plan for the morning. She had $297. She had no car. She had no telephone. She had a cottage with no electricity and a wood stove she would need to keep fed and a hand pump that worked and a chest full of objects she did not yet fully understand. She had a village 4 miles south of here, with a general store and a post office, and she had a tow truck driver named Pete who lived in Brunswick, and a woman named Cora who poured coffee in a diner in Portland, and she had a brass key on a faded blue ribbon that had opened the door of her grandmother's cottage on the first try after 38 years. She had enough. She unfolded the canvas tote bag and took out the cardigan and put it on over her sweater. She took out the orthopedic shoes, although she did not need them yet, and set them by the back door. She took out the small wooden box that held her mother's wedding ring and set it on the kitchen table beside the wrapped objects. She left the brass key on the table as well, because she did not want to lose it, and the table felt like the safest place in the cottage for things that mattered. She found a wool blanket in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed in the small bedroom off the kitchen, the bedroom that had been her grandmother's. The bed had been stripped down to the mattress, but the mattress was a horsehair one, old and firm and dry, and the blanket smelled faintly of cedar from decades of storage. She did not undress. She took off the orthopedic shoes she had not been wearing, took off her own walking shoes, wrapped herself in the wool blanket, and lay down on top of the bedspread that her grandmother had crocheted in the winter of 1962, and she closed her eyes. She did not fall asleep immediately. She lay in the dark of a room she had not slept in since she was a teenager, and she listened to the ocean outside the window, and she listened to the small sounds of the cottage, the settling of beams in the cooling air, the soft tick of the stove in the kitchen as the fire burned down, the occasional creak of the floorboards as the building adjusted to the temperature of the night. She thought about Frank. She thought about what Frank would have said if he could see her now. Frank had been a practical man. He had not been an adventurous man. He had not been the kind of man who would have approved of a woman his wife's age boarding a bus to Portland with $297 and a brass key. But Frank had also been a man who had loved her, and she thought, lying in the dark, that Frank would have understood. He would have shaken his head, and he would have made a face, and he would have eventually said, "Well, Margie, if you think this is what needs to happen, then this is what needs to happen." She fell asleep with that thought, and she slept hard, and she did not dream. She woke at first light. The window in the bedroom faced east, and the light that came in was the particular silver pink that the sky takes on over the ocean in October, the light Margaret remembered from every summer of her childhood. She lay in the bed for a moment and watched the light brighten on the wall opposite the window, and she felt rested in a way she had not felt rested in 14 months. The bed was hard. The blanket was scratchy. The room was cold because the fire in the kitchen had burned out hours ago. None of it mattered. She had slept the sleep of a person who was in the right place. She got up. Her back protested. Her knees protested. She ignored them. She built the fire back up in the kitchen stove, drawing on the wood box that her grandmother had kept stocked and that Margaret would need to figure out how to keep stocked herself before the temperature dropped any further. She pumped water and put the kettle on. She did not have food beyond the packet of crackers, but she had tea, and she had the small green apple she had bought at the bus station in Hartford and forgotten about until now. And she ate the apple slowly at the table while she drank her tea, and she planned her morning. She needed to walk to the village. She needed to introduce herself, carefully, to as few people as necessary, in order to accomplish what she needed to accomplish. She needed to find out whether there was a way to get a message to someone who knew about old objects, the kind of person who could look at what was wrapped in the tissue paper on her table and tell her, honestly, what she was dealing with. She needed groceries. She needed to know whether there was electricity to be restored or whether she would be living by lamplight and wood stove for the duration. She needed to find out about the property taxes, whether the small November check she had been mailing every year had actually been keeping the deed clear or whether some bureaucratic problem had developed in her absence. She also needed, she realized as she sat at the table, to be careful about whom she spoke to and what she said. Donald would notice she was gone. He would notice today, perhaps tomorrow at the latest, when he tried to call her about the papers she had not signed. He would not panic immediately. Donald did not panic, but he would investigate. He would call the apartment. He would knock on the door. He would let himself in with the spare key he kept, and he would see that her things were missing, and he would understand that she had left. He would not understand where she had gone, because he did not know about the cottage. But he would begin looking. He would call hospitals. He would call the bus station and the train station. He would, eventually, call the police, framing it as a welfare check, framing his 72-year-old mother as a confused elderly woman who had wandered off, framing himself as the concerned son. Margaret thought about this with a clarity that surprised her. She thought about Donald and how he operated, and she thought about Michael and how he followed Donald, and she thought about what they would do, and she made her calculations. She had a few days, perhaps a week. After that, she would need to be careful about her name being spoken in public places and towns, where summer visitors had homes and where conversations sometimes traveled in ways that were hard to predict. She finished her tea. She put on her coat and her walking shoes and the wool cap she had thrown into the canvas bag at the last moment because the weather report had said cold. She picked up the brass key and slipped it into her coat pocket, the same pocket where she had been carrying it for 38 years on the rare occasions when she put on this coat and needed to be reminded that the cottage was still hers. She left the wrapped objects on the table. She left the wooden box with her mother's ring. She left the chest in the front room. She locked the front door behind her, and she set out on foot down the dirt road, toward the paved road, toward the village. The walk was 4 miles. She had not walked 4 miles in one stretch since before Frank got sick. She did not know whether her body would hold up. She walked anyway, slowly, paying attention to the ground in front of her so she would not trip, paying attention to her breathing so she would not get ahead of herself. The October morning was cold and clear. The sky was a particular hard blue that the sky gets in northern New England in the fall, and the maples along the road were past their peak, but still holding some red, and the air smelled of pine and wood smoke and the distant salt of the sea. She made it to the village in just over an hour. She was tired but not exhausted, and her knees were complaining but not failing. She stopped at the edge of the village and stood for a moment by the cemetery and looked at the slate headstones leaning in the morning light. Her grandmother was buried somewhere in this cemetery. Her great-grandmother, her great-great-grandmother, the original Adelia, for whom a merchant vessel had been named in 1891. Margaret did not look for the graves. She would have time for that later. She walked into the village. The general store was open. A bell over the door rang when she pushed it inward, and the warmth of the store enveloped her, and a man behind the counter looked up. He was in his 60s, with a beard going gray and a flannel shirt, and the unhurried bearing of a man who had been running this store for a long time and was in no rush to be anywhere else. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Margaret said. She walked the aisle slowly. The store was small but well-stocked, the kind of store that had to be everything to everyone because it was the only store within 4 miles in any direction. She picked up a half loaf of bread, a small jar of peanut butter, a jar of jam, a half-dozen eggs, a block of cheddar cheese, a bag of coffee, a sack of flour, a sack of oats, a small bottle of vegetable oil, 2 pounds of potatoes, a small bag of onions, 3 carrots, a head of cabbage, a small piece of salt pork, and a tin of salt. She carried everything to the counter in 2 trips. The man behind the counter watched her without comment. "You staying out at the old bracket place?" he said. It was not a question. Margaret set the salt down on the counter and looked at him. "How did you know?" she asked. He smiled a small dry smile. "Pete called me last night. Asked if I'd keep an eye out. Said there was a lady up there alone who might be needing some things." Margaret felt the same tight feeling in her throat she had felt in the diner in Portland the night before. She had not factored Pete calling ahead. She had not factored the network of small kindnesses that existed in a place like this. She had not factored, in any of her careful calculations of money and distance and risk, the basic fact that some people, in some places, simply looked out for one another without being asked. "I'm Margaret Whitlock," she said. "My grandmother was Adelia Brackett, then Adelia Halsey when she married." The man nodded slowly. "Halsey," he said. "That'd be old Hollis Halsey's wife. He was a fisherman. Drowned in 58, I believe." 56, Margaret said. The man nodded again. He extended a large, rough hand across the counter. "Edgar Coombs. My grandfather knew yours. They went out for cod together back when there was still cod to go out for." Margaret shook his hand. His grip was firm but careful. He began ringing up her groceries. The total came to $38.15. Margaret counted out the money from her coat pocket. She had been careful with the cash, and she still had $258 left, and she calculated as she paid that this amount of food would last her a week, perhaps 10 days, if she was careful and supplemented with whatever she could find. She knew there were apples on the trees behind the cottage that her grandmother had planted in the 30s. She knew there were probably still mussels on the rocks at low tide. She knew the cellar of the cottage, if she could get into it, might have her grandmother's last harvest of potatoes and onions stored in the old way, though they would be 40 years old and good for nothing but the compost heap. Edgar Coombs put the groceries into 2 paper sacks. He set them on the counter. He looked at Margaret with the careful assessment of a man who had run a general store in a small village for 40 years. "How are you planning to get those back to the cottage?" he asked. "I'll carry them," Margaret said. He shook his head. "I close at noon on Wednesdays. I'll drive you home. No charge." She tried to protest. He did not let her. He told her to go down to the post office and the church if she had business there, and to come back at noon, and he would have the truck warm. He told her, with the same unhurried steadiness, that there was no point in arguing because he was going to do it whether she agreed or not, and she might as well save them both the time. Margaret smiled, for the first time in many days. She thanked him. She left the groceries on the counter and walked out into the morning sun. The post office was 3 doors down. She went in and asked the postmaster, a thin woman with steel-gray hair and a small American flag pinned to her cardigan, whether mail could be held at the post office for general delivery for a person who did not yet have a working mailbox. The postmaster said yes. Margaret asked whether the postmaster would, going forward, hold any mail addressed to Margaret Whitlock or to the Brackett Halsey cottage, and not forward it, and not discuss it with anyone who might inquire. The postmaster looked at her with sharper attention than the question seemed to warrant, and then she nodded. "I understand," the postmaster said. She did not ask Margaret to explain. Margaret was grateful. She suspected, looking at the postmaster's face, that the woman had understood the particular shape of Margaret's request without needing the particulars filled in. A woman of a certain age, traveling alone, asking that her mail be held privately. The postmaster had seen this before, perhaps. The postmaster knew, perhaps, that there were women who needed quiet. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Margaret thanked her and walked back up the single main street of the village toward the general store. It was 11:30. She had time to spare. She stopped at the small white church at the end of the street and walked into the cemetery beside it, and she found, in the older section near the back wall, the headstone she was looking for. Adelia Brackett, 1864 to 1934. Josiah Brackett, 1858 to 1929. Adelia Halsey, 1893 to 1971, beloved wife of Hollis. Hollis Halsey, 1888 to 1956. The names of her family, the dates of their lives. The granite still standing, the lettering still readable, the small flat stones at the bases still holding the rough form of carved flowers that someone had placed there a long time ago, and that the weather had not yet entirely worn away. She stood in front of her grandmother's stone for a long time. She thought about the chest in the front room of the cottage. She thought about the ledger with the inscription personal accounts and records of Captain Josiah Brackett. She thought about the brooch with the pale green stone and the ring with the dark red stone and the heavy gold coin. She thought about how the small green apple she had eaten that morning had been crisp and tart in a way the apples in the supermarket in Hartford never were, and how the water from the hand pump had tasted of iron and stone, and how the wool blanket had smelled of cedar, and she thought about how all of these things were her inheritance too, not just the chest and the cottage and the objects inside, but the particular taste of an apple and the particular smell of cedar and the particular sound of the Atlantic against the rocks of the point on an October morning. Donald and Michael had taken the house in Hartford. They had taken the car. They had taken the pension, and they had put their names on accounts that should have been hers alone. But they had not been able to take any of this, because they had not known any of this existed. She walked back to the general store at noon. Edgar Coombs was waiting with the truck running, an old red Chevy that looked like it had been on the road longer than Margaret had been alive, but that started obediently and rumbled along at a steady pace as Edgar drove her north out of the village and onto the harbor road. He did not make small talk. Margaret appreciated this. She watched the stone walls and the pine trees through the passenger window and tried to remember whether they had looked exactly this way when her father had driven her up here in the Plymouth station wagon in the summers of her childhood. When they reached the dirt turnoff, Edgar slowed and made the turn carefully. He drove down the rutted road with the practiced patience of a man whose vehicle was older than his daughter and who was not in a hurry to break either. He parked in the clearing in front of the cottage and got out and carried both sacks of groceries to the door himself before Margaret could object. He set them on the porch beside the door. He looked at the cottage with an expression Margaret could not quite read. "My father did some work on this roof in '58, he said, right after Hollis drowned. Your grandmother couldn't pay him. He never sent her a bill." Margaret did not know what to say to that. "I always wondered what happened to this place," Edgar said. "Folks in town figured it had been sold. Nobody ever saw anyone here." "My mother had it after my grandmother died," Margaret said. "Then it came to me when she passed in '86. My husband didn't like the ocean." Edgar nodded. He did not press the question. He looked at the cottage for another moment, and then he looked at Margaret. "You're going to need more wood than what's in there," he said. "And you're going to need someone to look at that chimney before you build any bigger fires. I'll send my nephew Royce up tomorrow. He does the chimneys for half the houses up here. He won't charge you for a look." "Edgar," Margaret said, "I can't keep accepting things." "You can't," Edgar said. He looked at her with the same steady directness Pete had looked at her with the night before. "You will. Up here, when someone comes home, the rest of us help them get settled. Your grandmother helped get my mother through a hard winter in '52. I'm not doing you a kindness. I'm paying a debt that's older than either of us." He got back in the truck and drove away. And Margaret stood on the porch of her grandmother's cottage with 2 sacks of groceries at her feet, and she thought about the word debt. She had been thinking of her situation in terms of what she had lost and what she had taken from her by people who should have protected her. She had not thought, until that moment, that there might also be a ledger of what her family had given to other people, a ledger that other people remembered and were prepared to honor, 50 years after her grandmother had stopped being alive to know it was being honored. She had not understood that the debts a family carried were not always debts you owed. Sometimes they were debts that were owed to you by people you had never met, on behalf of people you had loved. She brought the groceries inside. She put them away in the cupboards her grandmother had used, in the same arrangement her grandmother had used, with the flour and the oats and the salt on the upper shelves and the perishables on the lower shelves, and the bread in the wooden box on the counter that had always held bread because the wooden box on the counter had been made for that purpose. She made herself a sandwich. She ate it slowly at the table. She drank a glass of water from the hand pump. And then she went back into the front room, and she sat down in front of the wooden chest, and she opened it again. This time she was not looking for surprises. This time she was making an inventory. She worked at the kitchen table because the light was better there. She brought items out from the chest one at a time. She unwrapped them carefully. She set them on the table on top of a clean linen towel she found in one of the kitchen drawers. She wrote in a small notebook she had bought at the bus station a brief description of each object as she examined it. 12 ledgers, leather-bound, in good condition, dates ranging from 1891 to 1928. A brass sextant in a fitted wooden case, manufacturer's mark Spencer Browning and Company, London. A lacquered black box with a Chinese character on the lid, which Margaret did not open yet, because she could feel through the wood that there was something inside that rattled softly when she shifted the box, and she wanted to be prepared before she found out what. A bundle of envelopes tied with a red ribbon, 26 envelopes in total, all addressed in the same fine spidery hand as the ledgers, all to Adelia Brackett at the Cottage's address. The earliest envelope was postmarked Hong Kong, March 1895. The latest was postmarked San Francisco, November 1928. 26 letters. Margaret did not open them yet either. She wanted to read them in order, and she wanted to read them when she had time to read them properly, not in the rushed afternoon of an inventory. The velvet pouch, which she emptied again, carefully. The gold coin. The man's ring with the dark red stone. The brooch with the pale green stone. She set them on the linen towel and looked at them in the cold, clear afternoon light coming through the kitchen window, and the colors of the stones were even more remarkable in daylight than they had been in the flashlight beam the night before. Beneath the items she had already examined, in the bottom of the chest, were more things. A folded silk shawl in a shade of deep blue that Margaret had never seen on any fabric in any store. The silk was heavy and felt almost liquid in her hands. Embroidered along the edges in thread the color of cream were small dragons, each one slightly different from the others, executed with a precision that Margaret recognized as the work of someone who had spent decades doing this exact thing. The shawl was not in perfect condition. There was a small tear along one edge and a faint stain in one corner. But the silk was sound, and the embroidery was intact, and Margaret folded the shawl back up and set it aside. Beneath the shawl were two small ivory carvings, each one the size of an egg, depicting scenes that Margaret thought might be from Japanese folklore, although she did not know enough about Japanese folklore to be certain. There was a small wooden box of polished teak with a sliding lid that contained 8 pieces of jewelry, none of which Margaret could identify, but all of which were clearly old and clearly fine and clearly not the kind of jewelry one would buy at a department store in Hartford. There was a leather-bound book that turned out to be a Bible in a language Margaret did not recognize, with the inscription on the inside front cover dated 1812, in a Western European script that suggested the book had passed through more hands than just her great-grandfather's. There was a small silver flask, dinted and tarnished, but engraved on one side with the name J. Brackett and a date, 1891. There was a packet of papers that appeared to be stock certificates of some kind, in a company called the Pacific Trading Company, dated 1903. And at the very bottom of the chest, beneath everything else, lying flat against the cedar planking of the chest's floor, there was a single sheet of heavy paper folded in thirds. Margaret lifted it out carefully. She unfolded it on the kitchen table. The paper was thick and cream-colored, with the watermark of a paper mill that had probably gone out of business 100 years ago. The handwriting on the paper was not her great-grandfather's. The handwriting was different, smaller, more careful, the hand of a woman who had been taught penmanship in a different century. At the top of the paper was a date, June 12, 1931. To whoever finds this, the paper began. Margaret sat down in the kitchen chair. She read the letter slowly. My name is Adelia Brackett, and I am the widow of Captain Josiah Brackett of this town. My husband died in 1929 of a sudden weakness of the heart. He left behind this cottage and this chest, and a great many things in this chest that he had brought home over the course of his 40 years at sea. I have been a careful steward of these things since his death. I have not sold any of them, although there have been times when selling would have made my life easier. My reason for not selling is that I do not know enough about what is here to be a good seller. I have read about ladies who have been cheated out of valuable things by men who knew more than they did, and I have decided I would rather keep what I have than be cheated. I am writing this letter because I am 86 years old and I am not well. The doctor in town tells me I have months, perhaps less. My daughter Adelia, named for me, lives in this cottage with her husband Hollis, and they have a daughter Lillian who is 8 years old. I have told my daughter about this chest, but I have not told her everything that is in it, because I do not think she yet has the temperament for such things. She is a kind girl, but she is easily worried, and I have not wanted to add to her worries by burdening her with a responsibility she may not be ready for. I am leaving this letter at the bottom of the chest, so that whoever opens this chest someday, in some year I cannot foresee, may understand what they are looking at. The most valuable thing in this chest is the ring with the red stone. Josiah told me it was a ruby. He won it in a card game in Bombay in 1904. The man he won it from was a British colonel who had been given it by an Indian prince in 1878. Josiah said the colonel told him the prince had been a fool to give it away. I do not know what the ring is worth. I have heard tell that fine rubies can be worth a great deal of money. The ring should be examined by someone who knows. The brooch with the green stone is jade. Josiah bought it in Canton in 1912 from a merchant who said it had belonged to a member of the imperial family before the dynasty fell. I cannot say whether this is true. The merchant may have been lying. But the stone is jade of a quality I have not seen in any other jade, and I have been shown a fair amount of jade by visitors over the years who have wished to admire it. The gold coin is from China. I do not know its date or its value. Josiah said the man who gave it to him called it a sice. It was a gift, not a purchase, and it was given for a kindness Josiah had done in a port town. The kindness, as Josiah told it, involved giving a frightened young woman safe passage on his ship away from a situation that would have been very bad for her. I have always liked that this coin came to us because of a kindness. The shawl is silk and the embroidery is from the city of Suzhou, which Josiah told me was famous for embroidery. The shawl was a gift from a Chinese merchant's wife with whom I corresponded for some years, although I never met her. She and I exchanged letters about gardening and children and the small things that women correspond about regardless of which side of the ocean they live on. She died in 1923. Her son sent me a final letter telling me of her death and enclosing the shawl, which she had wished me to have. The carvings are netsuke from Japan. The teak box contains items Josiah collected from various ports over the years. I do not know the value of any of these. The stock certificates are in a company that, last I heard, was no longer operating. I have not had the heart to look into them, as Josiah believed in the company very much and bought the shares with money he could not really afford to spend. I keep them because they were his. The letters tied with red ribbon are the letters my husband wrote me from his voyages. They are not for selling. They are for reading, if whoever opens this chest cares to know what kind of man he was. I would ask only one thing of whoever finds this chest after my time and my daughter's time. If you are a woman of this family and you have come to this cottage because you needed to come to this cottage, please understand that everything in this chest is yours to use as you need to use it. My husband sailed for 40 years and brought these things home, and he intended them to provide for the women of this family in whatever way each woman might need them to. He believed, and I believe, that women of this family will, from time to time, need to start over. He wanted there to be something here for them when they did. I have prayed for you, whoever you are. Adelia Brackett. Margaret read the letter twice. Then she read it a third time. Then she folded it carefully and set it on the table and put both her hands flat on the maple wood that her great-great-grandfather Ezra had made in 1903, and she pressed down hard on the wood with her palms, because she needed something solid under her hands, something that had been made by someone in her own family, something that connected her physically to the long line of people whose names were now under granite headstones in the cemetery behind the small white church 4 miles away. Her great-grandmother Adelia had written this letter in 1931. She had written it specifically for Margaret. Not Margaret by name. Margaret had not yet been born in 1931. Margaret's mother had been 8 years old in 1931. But Adelia had written this letter for whoever in her line of women might someday come to this cottage and open this chest because she needed to. Adelia had not known when. She had not known who. She had only known, with the clarity of a woman who had lived 86 years, that someday a woman in this family was going to need to start over, and she had wanted there to be something here for her when she did. Margaret thought about her grandmother Adelia, the second Adelia, who had inherited the chest and had not sold any of it. She thought about her mother Lillian, who had inherited the chest and had not sold any of it either, who had mentioned it only once, on her deathbed, in a sentence Margaret had not understood. 3 generations of women had kept this chest closed and intact, had paid the taxes on this cottage, had not let go of what they had been given. 3 generations of women had passed the inheritance forward without diminishing it, because they had understood, in the way women in this family seemed to understand, that what was in the chest was not for them. What was in the chest was for whichever woman, in whichever generation, eventually needed it. That woman was Margaret. She sat at the table for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor as the sun went around the cottage. She did not get up. She did not make tea. She did not do anything except sit at the table with her hands flat on the wood, and let the understanding settle into her, fully, with all its weight. She was not alone. She had thought she was alone since Frank died. She had thought she was alone in a way that could not be remedied by anyone or anything. But she was not alone. She had a great-grandmother who had written a letter 85 years ago, a letter that was waiting at the bottom of a cedar chest in a cottage by the sea, waiting for Margaret to come home and find it. She had a grandmother who had kept the chest unopened, holding it in trust. She had a mother who had done the same. She had 3 generations of women behind her, and she was the current keeper of what those women had preserved, and she was not going to fail them. She got up. She washed her face in the basin by the kitchen sink. She put the kettle on. She made herself another cup of tea. She returned to the table and began, methodically, to put the objects back into the chest. She wrapped each one carefully. She placed each one in the same position it had been in when she found it, so that the chest itself would not be disturbed in its long arrangement. She kept out only one thing. She kept out the letter from her great-grandmother. She folded the letter and put it in the small wooden box on the table beside her mother's wedding ring. The letter and the ring belonged together. They were the 2 things in this house that she would carry with her if she ever had to leave again. When the chest was repacked, she closed the lid and pressed the brass clasps back into place. She stood up from where she had been kneeling in front of the chest. Her knees were protesting again, more loudly this time, but she ignored them because the kneeling had been necessary and because what came next required her to be standing. She walked back into the kitchen and added another log to the fire. She filled the kettle for one more pot of tea. She sat down at the table and opened the small notebook in which she had been making her inventory, and she turned to a fresh page, and she wrote at the top, in her careful schoolteacher's handwriting, the word plan. She made her plan. She wrote it down in sentences and in lists. She did not rush. She let herself think slowly and carefully, the way her great-grandmother Adelia must have thought when she had written her letter in 1931. She wrote down the names of the people she needed to find. A lawyer, a good lawyer, in Portland or in Brunswick, someone who specialized in elder law and who would understand the situation with Donald and the joint account and the power of attorney that had been pushed on her under false pretenses. An appraiser, ideally one who specialized in maritime artifacts and Asian decorative arts. Someone who could come to the cottage and look at the contents of the chest and tell her honestly what each item was and what it was worth. She would not be selling anything yet, but she needed to know what she had, in proper terms, in numbers, so that she could make decisions from a position of knowledge rather than guesswork. She wrote down the practical things she needed to do. Get the chimney inspected. Find out about restoring electricity to the cottage. Find out about replacing the roof shingles where the slight sag suggested the boards beneath might be soft. Find out about the deed, the taxes, the title of the property, and make sure that whatever bureaucratic processes existed were entirely current and entirely clear. She did not yet need a working telephone, but she would eventually. She did not yet need a car, but she would eventually. She did not yet need many things, but she would eventually. She wrote down the names of the people who had already helped her. Pete the tow truck driver in Brunswick, Cora at the diner in Portland, Edgar Coombs at the general store, the thin woman at the post office whose name she had not yet learned. She would need to thank these people properly, in ways that did not embarrass them, in the small, careful currencies of a small, careful community. She would learn how to do this. She had a feeling that her grandmother and great-grandmother had been good at this, and that the lessons were embedded in the cottage itself, in the cedar chest, in the maple table, and the iron pump and the cast-iron stove, and she would learn the lessons by living with the objects that had been arranged by people who had understood. She wrote down the last thing on her list at the bottom of the page. She underlined it twice. Do not let Donald find me before I am ready. That was the work of the coming weeks. She would set up her affairs slowly and carefully, in her own name, on her own terms. She would establish her position, legally and financially, before her sons knew where she was. She would make sure that when Donald did eventually find her, which he would, because Donald was nothing if not persistent, he would find her in a position of strength. He would find her with her cottage repaired and her chest cataloged and her papers in order, and he would find her with the kind of help and the kind of advice and the kind of legal standing that would make her difficult to push around. He had thought he had taken everything. He had thought she had nothing. He had moved her into a beige apartment on Asylum Avenue and assumed that the rest of her life would proceed quietly, in his direction, on his terms. He had not known about the cottage. He had not known about the chest. He had not known about Adelia Brackett, born in 1864, who had written a letter in 1931 to a granddaughter she would never meet, leaving her, in plain words, everything she would need to start over. Margaret closed the notebook. She finished her tea. She got up from the table and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the strip of October sea, gray and steady and ancient, the same sea her grandmother had looked at, the same sea her great-grandmother had looked at, the same sea that would still be here long after Margaret and her sons and the entire generation that had pushed her into the beige apartment were gone. She was 72 years old, and she was just beginning. The first winter at the cottage taught Margaret what her grandmother and great-grandmother had already known about this particular stretch of coast, which was that winter on the point was its own form of education. The wind came off the water in long sustained pushes that bent the pines at the back of the property and rattled the kitchen window in its frame. The temperature dropped below 0 nights in the first month of January. The snow came in bands, sometimes light and dry, sometimes heavy and wet, and Margaret learned to read the sky the way Edgar Coombs read it, by the particular color of the gray above the harbor and the way the gulls behaved before a storm. She kept the wood stove going day and night. Royce had stacked her 4 cords of dry oak and maple along the south wall of the cottage in November, and Margaret moved through it carefully, 2 logs in the morning and 3 at night, with smaller pieces of kindling between when the fire needed coaxing. She had learned that the stove was her companion. She talked to it sometimes when she was banking the coals in the evening, small comments about the day, the way she used to talk to Frank when he was reading the newspaper in his chair. The stove did not answer, but it kept her warm, and warmth was a form of answer Margaret had come to value above many other forms. She bought a small radio in December from the general store. Edgar had recommended a model that ran on batteries as well as wall current, in case of power failures. Margaret listened to the public station out of Portland in the evenings, the slow, steady programs of classical music and the careful reading of news. She did not watch television. She had decided, in those first weeks at the cottage, that she had spent enough of her life with the television on in the background, and that the rest of her years would belong to the radio and to the sound of the ocean and to the small particular noises of a building made of wood and stone responding to the weather. She wrote in her notebook every night before bed. She had begun this practice the 3rd week, after the appraisal, when she had so many new pieces of information to keep track of that she had needed a system. The system had grown into something larger. The notebook had become, by January, a kind of running record of her thoughts, her plans, the names of people she had met, the small observations she wanted to remember. She bought a second notebook at the village stationery counter when the first one filled up. The second one filled up in March. By the end of the first year, she had used 6 notebooks, and she kept them stacked in a wooden crate beside the bed in her grandmother's room. She did not reread them often. The point of the notebooks was the writing of them, not the rereading. The writing was the way she was learning to be alone with her own mind. Helen Crockett from the post office became, in the second month, a friend. Margaret had not gone looking for a friend. Helen had simply emerged into the role, gradually, through the small mechanism of Margaret's twice-weekly visits to collect her mail. Helen always had coffee on in the back room of the post office, and after the second visit she began offering Margaret a cup, and after the fifth visit she began sitting down with Margaret to drink her own cup, and by the eighth visit the two women were having conversations that lasted long enough that Helen had to put the closed sign in the window for 15 minutes while they finished. Helen was 68. She had been widowed for 9 years. Her husband had been the village schoolteacher for 42 years and had died of a heart attack at his desk during a parent-teacher conference. Helen had taken over the post office shortly after, more for something to do than for the modest salary, and she had been running it ever since. Helen knew everyone in the village and most of the families who had been in the village for the past 100 years. She had grown up here. Her own grandmother had been a friend of Adelia Halsey, and Helen remembered being taken to the cottage as a child of 7 or 8 to deliver a casserole the winter after Hollis Halsey drowned. Helen described to Margaret what the cottage had looked like in the winter of 1956, the small details of furniture and curtains and the kitchen pantry that Margaret had been trying to reconstruct from her own much later memories. Helen confirmed certain things. She corrected others. She filled in gaps Margaret had not even known existed. Your grandmother kept on as if Hollis was still coming home, Helen said one afternoon, the coffee between them, the small space heater in the back room of the post office humming softly. For about 2 years. She set the table for 2 every night. She washed his work clothes every Monday, even though there was nothing in them to wash. People in the village talked about it. Some of them thought she had lost her wits. My mother said she was just doing what she needed to do to get from one day to the next. Eventually she stopped. I remember the first time we came to visit, and there was just one place at the table. My mother cried in the car on the drive home. Margaret had not known any of this. Her grandmother had been 71 when Hollis drowned, and Margaret had been a child of 6, and her grandmother had not been the sort of woman who burdened her grandchildren with grief. Margaret remembered her grandmother as steady and slightly stern, capable in the kitchen, attentive in the garden, a woman who hummed wordlessly while she worked. She had not known the woman who had set the table for 2 years. She found herself, on the walk back to the cottage that afternoon, thinking about that woman with new attention, with the kind of attention you pay to a person you suddenly realize you have not fully known. She mentioned it to Pauline at their next meeting in Brunswick. Pauline had taken to including a small personal conversation at the end of their legal sessions, 10 or 15 minutes when the documents were back in the folder and the official business was done. Pauline was 49, divorced, no children, the daughter of a Maine fisherman and a librarian. She had grown up in Boothbay and gone to law school at the University of Maine and had been practicing in Brunswick for 21 years. She was not married to her work in the way that lawyers in larger cities sometimes were. She kept a garden. She read novels. She had a black Labrador named Buster who came to the office most days and slept under her desk. Pauline listened to Margaret's account of Helen's story about Adelia Halsey. She nodded slowly when Margaret was finished. My grandmother used to say that women of that generation carried more than they ever showed, Pauline said. She'd seen it herself. She said the strong ones learned how to hold a feeling without it being visible from the outside. She thought it was a skill that was being lost. She thought the next generation, women like my mother, were better off for not having to learn it. But she also thought something had been lost in the change. I think she might have been right, Margaret said. Pauline poured them each a second cup of coffee. The afternoon outside her office window was the particular bright cold of February in Maine, the sun hard on the snow piled at the edges of the parking lot, the sky a blue so clean it almost hurt to look at. What are you going to do with the chest? Pauline asked. Long term. Have you thought about it? Margaret had thought about it. She had thought about it nearly every day since the appraisal. The $4 million figure had become familiar to her in the way large abstract numbers become familiar when you live with them, useful as a fact, but not particularly meaningful as a guide to action. She was not a woman who needed $4 million. She did not want a different cottage. She did not want a car beyond the small reliable one she had bought in January. She did not want clothes or trips or any of the things that money was supposed to enable. She had what she needed. I've been thinking about that, Margaret said. I want to be careful with it. The chest was kept whole by 3 women before me. I don't want to be the one who breaks it apart. Pauline nodded. It doesn't have to be one decision, she said. You could sell pieces over time as needs arise. You could keep most of it together as a collection. You could establish a trust that holds the collection and distributes it according to whatever rules you decide on. There are a lot of structures. Margaret thought about this on the drive home. She was a careful driver. She still had not regained the easy confidence behind the wheel that she had once had, and she stayed in the right lane on the highway and kept her speed 5 miles below the limit and washed her mirrors more often than was probably necessary. The drive from Brunswick to the cottage took her past the cemetery and the white church and the village, and she nodded at the familiar landmarks the way she now nodded at Edgar Coombs through the window of the general store and at Beth Ashby through the window of the library, small gestures of belonging that she had been growing into without quite intending to. She decided, that evening, that she would establish a trust. She would write the trust herself, with Pauline's help, and she would build it around the chest as a unit. The trust would own the contents of the chest. The trust would have a board of trustees consisting of the women in the family who would inherit the cottage in turn, with provisions for what would happen if the line of women failed. The trust would be empowered to sell items from the collection only under specific circumstances, and the proceeds of any sale would be used only for specific purposes, and the purposes would be named in the trust document. She wrote out the purposes that night at the kitchen table. The first purpose was the maintenance of the cottage and the property in perpetuity as a home for women of this family who needed it. The second purpose was the support of any woman of this family who was, at any time, in the situation of needing to start over, in the way Margaret had been in the situation of needing to start over. The third purpose was the support, modest but real, of other women in the local community who were in similar situations and who had been identified to the trust through a process Margaret would have to figure out. The fourth purpose was the preservation of the records and history of the family, including the writing and eventual publication of any books or documents drawn from the contents of the chest. She read the 4 purposes back to herself. She thought about them. She added a fifth, the keeping of the chest itself, intact and protected, as a permanent reminder of what one generation could leave for the women who would come after. She showed the list to Pauline at their next meeting. Pauline read it slowly. Pauline took her glasses off when she was finished and looked at Margaret with an expression Margaret had not seen on her before. "Mrs. Whitlock," Pauline said. Margaret said, "Please. We've been working together for 5 months." "Margaret," Pauline said, "I want to tell you something. I have been practicing law for 21 years. I have helped a lot of older women sort out their estates. Most of them are not thinking about future generations of women they will never meet. Most of them are thinking about how to leave the most money to the children who paid the most attention to them and the least to the children who did not. I want you to know that what you are doing is unusual and that I think it is important and that I am going to help you do it properly." Margaret felt her throat tighten. She did not cry. She had not been crying since the first night at the cottage, the night she had read the letter from her great-grandmother. But she felt the tightness, and she let Pauline see it, because she had decided, over the months, that there were some people you could let see you. "Thank you, Pauline." "My pleasure." They worked on the trust document together over the next 2 months, slowly, line by line, with Margaret making suggestions and Pauline refining them into the careful legal language that would hold up in any court. When they were finished in April, the document was 37 pages long and was, Pauline told her, one of the more carefully constructed trust instruments she had ever drafted. The trust was named the Brackett Halsey Women's Trust. Margaret signed it on a Thursday afternoon in Pauline's office, in front of 2 witnesses and a notary. The trust came into being. The third purpose, the one about supporting other women in the local community, took shape more slowly, through the work of figuring out how it might actually operate. Margaret did not want a foundation with applications and committees and the formal apparatus of charity. She wanted something quieter and more direct. She realized after thinking about it for some weeks, the kind of help her grandmother Adelia Halsey had probably given to other women in the village over the course of her life, the help that nobody had ever written down but that had been remembered. She talked to Helen about it. Helen was the right person to talk to about such things, because Helen knew everyone. Helen listened, and she thought, and at the end of the conversation she said, "Margaret, you don't need a system. You just need to be available. Let me know what you can do and how much, and I will let you know when there's a need. Most of the time, you won't be the only person helping. You'll be one of several. We've been doing this in this village for a long time. You're just joining what's already here." Margaret had not thought about it that way. She had been thinking of herself as starting something, when in fact she was being invited into something that had been running for 150 years. She felt, sitting in the back room of the post office with Helen, the same feeling she had felt the first morning at the cottage when she had hung her coat on her grandmother's hook. The feeling of arriving at a place where she had always belonged, without quite knowing she belonged there. The first woman she helped was a 34-year-old named Lainey Hatch, who lived in a trailer on a back road 8 miles south of the village with 2 small children and a husband who had begun drinking again after 11 years of sobriety. Helen brought the situation to Margaret's attention in late May. Lainey's husband had not yet become physically dangerous, but the family had no savings, and the husband had not held a job in 4 months. And Lainey was working 2 shifts at the diner in the next town over and barely keeping the trailer's electricity on. What she needed, Helen said, was not a big intervention. She needed a security deposit on an apartment in Brunswick where her sister had offered her and the children a room. She needed about $1,200, and she needed it within the week. Margaret wrote a check that afternoon. She gave it to Helen, who would deliver it to Lainey through a route that involved a third party, so that Lainey would not feel she was receiving charity from a specific person to whom she would feel obligated. The check was made out from the Brackett-Halsey Women's Trust. The memo line read, "Simply, for what is needed." A week later, Helen reported that Lainey and the children had moved in with the sister. The husband had stayed in the trailer. Lainey had filed the paperwork for a protective order on Pauline's advice, which Helen had also relayed through the same indirect route. Lainey was looking for work in Brunswick. The children were going to be enrolled in school there in the fall. Margaret asked Helen, gently, whether there was anything else she should be doing for Lainey. Helen thought about it. Not directly, Helen said. She doesn't know exactly who the money came from. That's the way she wants it, and I think that's the way you want it too. But if you want to do something quiet, you could put aside a small amount each month, just sitting in an account, so that when something else comes up, and something else always does, you'll have the resources to respond without having to think about it. Margaret set up the account that week. She funded it with an initial deposit of $15,000 and a standing monthly transfer of $1,000. The account would, she calculated, accumulate at a rate that would let it respond to several small situations a year indefinitely without ever depleting the principal. She named the account, on the bank's records, the Adelio account, after her great-grandmother who had written the letter that had told her everything she needed to know about what to do. The summer of the first year at the cottage was the summer Sarah came to visit alone for the first time. Sarah was 12 by then, a thin, solemn girl with her grandfather Frank's eyes and her mother's careful hands, and she was old enough that her parents agreed she could fly from Hartford to Portland alone, where Margaret would meet her at the airport. Margaret had been preparing for the visit for weeks. She had not bought toys or planned activities. She had decided that what she wanted to give Sarah was the cottage itself, slowly, in the way her grandmother had given the cottage to her in the summers of her childhood. Sarah arrived on the second Sunday in July. She came down the jetway with a small backpack and the slightly stunned look of a child who had flown alone for the first time. She saw Margaret in the waiting area and ran the last 20 feet and put her arms around her grandmother's waist and held on for longer than Margaret had expected. Margaret held her back. They stood in the airport for a moment without speaking. "Hello, Sarah," Margaret said. "Hello, Grandma." Margaret drove her back to the cottage. They stopped at the diner where Cora still worked, and Cora made a fuss over Sarah in the way of a woman who had been waiting for a child to walk into her diner so she could fuss over her. And Sarah ate a grilled cheese sandwich and drank a chocolate milkshake and answered Cora's questions about her flight with the polite patience of a child who had been raised by a careful mother. When they got back in the car, Sarah was tired and a little quiet, and Margaret did not press her, and they drove the rest of the way in companionable silence. Sarah stayed for 2 weeks. Margaret showed her everything. The rocks at the point, the apple trees behind the house, the path through the pines to the small inlet where you could find sea glass at low tide. She showed her how to bank a fire in the wood stove. She showed her how to prime the hand pump. She let her open the chest in the front room and pick up the items one by one, with cotton gloves, and ask questions, and Margaret answered every question with the same careful seriousness she had answered Sarah's questions in. Sarah held the porcelain bowl once. The bowl had come back from auction in pieces, in a sense, because Margaret had used some of the proceeds and the rest had gone into the trust. But the duplicate, The one that had not been sold because there was only one, the jade brooch, was the piece Sarah loved most. She turned it in her hands under the kitchen lamp. She looked at the green stone for a long time. "It's the same color as the ocean, sometimes," she said, "when the sun comes through it." "Yes," Margaret said. "I noticed that too." "Did great-great-great-grandmother know that?" "I think she did," Margaret said. "I think she noticed it. I think that may be why she kept it." They walked to the village every other day. Margaret introduced Sarah to Edgar Coombs, and to Helen, and to Beth Ashby at the library. Sarah sat in the back room of the post office and drank a cup of weak coffee, the same coffee Margaret drank, and she listened to Helen's stories about the old days in the village with the absorbed attention of a child who had figured out that adult conversations contained more interesting material than adults usually realized. Helen told Sarah about a winter in the 1940s when the harbor had frozen all the way out to the buoy, and the children of the village had skated on it for 3 weeks, and a man named Olaf Peterson had brought out a record player and an extension cord and played waltzes on the ice. Sarah listened with her mouth slightly open. Margaret watched her listen. She thought, watching, that Sarah was the kind of child who would carry this story. The story had now been told, and now Sarah would carry it, and someday, perhaps long after Margaret was gone, Sarah would tell it to her own grandchild in some other back room of some other small post office somewhere on the coast. On the last morning of her visit, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with Margaret and ate scrambled eggs and toast. The sun was coming through the kitchen window at the particular angle. Margaret had been waiting for the right moment to tell Sarah what she had decided to tell her, and she had been waiting because she had wanted to make sure that the moment came naturally, the way important moments did when you did not force them. "Sarah," Margaret said, "I want you to know something." Sarah looked up from her eggs. "When I am gone," Margaret said, "this cottage will be yours. The chest will be yours. The brass key on the blue ribbon will be yours. I have set up a trust to make sure that nothing can be taken from you and nothing can be sold against your wishes. The cottage and the chest will belong to you in the same way they belonged to me, and to my mother, and to my grandmother, and to my great-grandmother before that. You will be the next keeper. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Sarah set down her fork. She thought about it. She was a child who thought about things before she answered. "I think so," she said. "It means the things in the chest, they aren't really mine. They're for the next person too. And my job is to keep them safe, so the next person has them when she needs them." Margaret felt the room go very still around her. She had not used those exact words. Sarah had arrived at them on her own. "Yes," Margaret said. "That is exactly what it means." "Okay," Sarah said. She picked up her fork and continued eating her eggs. The matter was settled. Margaret watched her, and she thought about her great-grandmother Adelia, born in 1864, and she thought about her grandmother Adelia, born in 1893, and she thought about her mother Lillian, born in 1923, and she thought about herself, born in 1946, and she thought about Sarah, born in 2004, and she thought about how every one of these women had been a child once, sitting at this same kitchen table, eating something simple while the morning light came in through the window at the same angle, and how the chain of women in this family had now reached the youngest link in the chain, and the youngest link in the chain had just demonstrated, at the age of 12, that she understood exactly what kind of chain she was a part of. The book began that autumn, after Sarah had gone home. Margaret had been thinking about the book for months, but she had not actually started writing until the morning after she put Sarah on the plane back to Hartford. When she came back to the cottage and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a stack of her great-grandfather's letters and a new blank notebook, and she wrote, in her careful schoolteacher's handwriting, at the top of the first page, the words, "A Sea Captain's Daughter." The title came to her without effort. She had not been planning what she would call the book. She had been planning what the book would contain, the chapters and the themes and the structure, but the title arrived unbidden, and she wrote it down, and she knew immediately that it was the right title. The book was not about Josiah Brackett, although Josiah Brackett would be in it. The book was about Adelia Brackett, his wife, and about the daughter and granddaughter and great-granddaughter who had inherited the chest he had filled and the cottage he had bought, and about what it meant to be the daughter, in the deeper sense, of a man who had spent 40 years on the ocean and had brought home pieces of the world for the women who would come after him. She wrote slowly. She wrote in the evenings, mostly, by the lamp on the kitchen table. She wrote on Sunday afternoons after church. She wrote in the early mornings sometimes when she could not sleep. She filled the notebook in 3 months. She bought another. She filled it in 2 months. She bought a typewriter on a trip into Portland with Pauline, a small portable model that Beth Ashby helped her learn to use at the library, and she began typing the notebooks up into a manuscript, slowly, 1 chapter at a time, with revisions on each page as she went. She finished the first draft in April of the second year. She showed it to Beth at the library, who had become, over the months, the person Margaret most trusted with the question of whether something she had written was any good. Beth read the manuscript over the course of 2 weeks. She brought it back to Margaret on a Tuesday afternoon with a yellow legal pad full of notes. "Margaret," Beth said, "I'm not a literary critic. I'm a librarian in a town with 700 people in it. So you have to take what I'm about to say with the appropriate amount of salt." "I'm taking it with salt. This is a real book," Beth said. "This is a book that other people are going to want to read. It needs work, like every first draft needs work. But the bones of it are there, and the bones are good." Margaret took the manuscript home. She worked on the revisions all summer. Beth's notes had been careful and specific, and they pointed Margaret toward problems Margaret had already half noticed but had not let herself fully see. She rewrote 2 chapters from the beginning. She added a chapter about Hollis Halsey, her grandfather, drawn from things Helen had told her, and from a small bundle of his own letters that Margaret had found in a box in the back of the bedroom closet during the spring cleaning. Letters Hollis had written to her grandmother during the months he had been at sea on a fishing boat in 1949. She cut a chapter about the porcelain bowl that had felt to her, on rereading, like she was showing off about the auction price. The auction price was not the point. The point was what the bowl had meant when Josiah had paid $18 for it in Canton in 1909. She finished the second draft in October. She showed it to Beth, who had fewer notes this time. She did one more pass through the manuscript on her own. By December, she had a final draft she was willing to send out. The book was published in the fall of the 4th year at the Cottage, by a small press in Portland that specialized in regional history. The print run was modest, 2,000 copies, with a careful cover that featured a photograph of the cottage and a small inset image of the jade brooch. Beth Ashby organized a reading at the library, and 43 people came, including Sarah, who flew up from Hartford with her parents for the event. Margaret read 3 short passages from the book. She had been nervous about the reading for weeks, and her hands shook slightly as she held the pages, but her voice was steady, and when she was finished the room was quiet for a long moment before the applause began. Donald came up to her afterward. He had attended with his wife Karen, who had been increasingly present at family events since the reconciliation began. Donald had a copy of the book in his hand. He had been holding it through the reading. He did not seem to know quite what to say. He had been a different person now for some time, but the differences sometimes still surprised him, and he stood in front of his mother holding the book like a boy holding a school project he had worked harder on than he expected. "I read it," he said. "I read it twice, actually, before tonight. I just wanted you to know." "Thank you, Donald. There's a part in the chapter about grandmother Lillian," he said, "where you talk about her last weeks in the convalescent center. The thing about how she didn't talk about the chest until the morphine made her drift. I didn't know any of that, Mom. I didn't know any of what she said to you. I should have been there." Margaret looked at him. He was 56 years old. He was her son. He had become, over the past 4 years, the kind of man Frank would have recognized again as the boy they had raised, which was not the kind of man he had been when he had filed the false affidavit in the Hartford attorney's office. The change had not been easy for him. It had cost him things. The senior partnership Marcus had been dangling in front of him had gone to someone else when Donald had insisted on dissolving the joint account and signing the repayment agreement. Karen had left him for 6 months and had come back only after a year of marriage counseling that Donald had paid for himself. The Hartford attorney had reported Donald to the State Bar Association, and Donald had received a formal censure that would stay on his record for the rest of his career. None of it had stopped him from showing up at the cottage every October for the annual visit, alone, the way Margaret had asked, the way they had agreed. "You weren't ready then," Margaret said gently. "You're here now." Donald nodded. He looked down at the book in his hands. "Could you sign it for me?" "Of course." She took the book and opened it to the title page. She thought for a moment. Then she wrote, in her schoolteacher's handwriting, "To my son Donald, who has done the hard work. With love, Mom." She closed the book and handed it back to him. He took it carefully, with both hands, and he did not open it again to look at the inscription. He would open it later, alone, in the small house he had bought after the divorce papers had been withdrawn and Karen had come home. He would read the inscription standing in his kitchen, with the book in his hands, and his shoulders would shake briefly with the silent crying he had become capable of in the last 4 years. And he would put the book on the small shelf in his living room where he kept the books that mattered to him, and the book would stay there for the rest of his life. The second wave of visitors at the cottage began in the 5th year. The book had drawn attention from people interested in maritime history, and Margaret began receiving letters from researchers and historians and the occasional descendant of another sea captain who had recognized something in her great-grandfather's voyages. She answered every letter. She wrote her replies by hand, in her careful schoolteacher's handwriting, on the same kind of cream-colored stationery she had bought at the village stationery counter the first month she had been at the cottage. She did not have email. She had not bothered to learn. She did not feel she was missing anything important. A small, steady stream of people began making the drive up the harbor road to visit. Margaret was selective. She did not invite strangers into her home casually. But for those she did invite, the routine became familiar. A pot of coffee on the stove, a plate of cookies on the kitchen table, the careful taking out of 1 or 2 items from the chest at a time, with cotton gloves, with the visitor sitting opposite Margaret at the table and listening to the story that went with each object. Many of the visitors were academics. Some were collectors. A few were simply curious. One of the visitors, in the 7th year, was a woman named Felicia Brennan from Halifax, Nova Scotia. She had written to Margaret 6 months earlier with a careful letter asking whether she might be permitted to visit. She was the great-granddaughter of a Nova Scotian sea captain named Angus Brennan, who had been a contemporary of Josiah Brackett's, and she was researching the merchant trade routes of the late 19th century for a book she was hoping to write. Margaret had liked the letter. She had invited Felicia to come. Felicia arrived in May. She was 61, divorced, recently retired from a career as a high school history teacher. She had driven down from Halifax in a small white car with a Canadian license plate. She wore practical clothes and sensible shoes and had the easy directness of a woman who had taught teenagers for 38 years and had stopped being intimidated by anything around the age of 40. She and Margaret got on, immediately, in the way 2 women in their 60s sometimes get on when they recognize in each other a similar quality of attention to the world. Felicia stayed for 3 days. They went through the ledgers together. They went through the bundle of letters. They discovered, in one of the letters from 1907, a reference to a Captain Brennan with whom Josiah had taken a meal in Singapore on a return voyage from the Strait of Malacca. Felicia took photographs of the relevant page. She had brought with her a similar bundle of letters from her own great-grandfather, and she and Margaret laid them out on the kitchen table and cross-referenced the dates, and they discovered 3 separate instances in which Josiah Brackett and Angus Brennan had been in the same port at the same time, and 1 instance in which they had clearly dined together based on the corresponding entries in both men's records. It was the most fun Margaret had had in months. Not the fun of leisure. The fun of work, of the careful satisfaction of fitting 2 pieces of evidence together and seeing that they fit. Felicia felt it too. They worked until late in the evenings, by lamplight, with cups of tea between them and the wood stove burning low. On the last morning, Felicia stood in the kitchen with her bag packed and her car keys in her hand, and she looked at Margaret with an expression Margaret had come to recognize in the visitors who had stayed long enough to want to come back. "Margaret," Felicia said, "I don't suppose you'd consider, this is presumptuous, but I don't suppose you'd consider co-writing the book." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She had not been expecting it. She had not been thinking about another book. She had thought she had written her book, the book about her own family, and that any further writing was beyond what she had wanted to take on. "What kind of book?" she asked. "A book about the 2 captains, and through them about the trade between New England and the Maritimes and the China coast in their period. A book that uses your great-grandfather's records and mine as the primary sources. A book about what these men actually did, day by day, voyage by voyage, and what it meant for the women they came home to." Margaret thought about it. She thought about it for the rest of the morning, and she thought about it through the drive to the village where she helped Felicia find the road back to the highway, and she thought about it on the drive home, and by the time she reached the cottage, she had decided. She wrote to Felicia the next day. She accepted the proposal. She told Felicia that she had 2 conditions. The first was that the work would proceed at the pace of two women in their 60s who did not need to hurry. The second was that any proceeds from the book, after the publisher's share and any modest expenses, would go to the trust to fund the third purpose, the support of women in their respective communities who needed to start over. Felicia wrote back accepting both conditions. She drove down to the cottage again in August and again in October, and she and Margaret began the work of the second book. That winter, the seventh winter at the cottage, was the winter Margaret began to feel her age more sharply. Not in any single dramatic way. Her body had been steadily teaching her, over the years, that 70 was not 80 and 80 was not 90, and she had been listening to those lessons. But the seventh winter brought a particular kind of tiredness she had not felt before. She slept later in the mornings. She found herself sitting in the rocking chair in the front room for longer stretches in the afternoons, with a book in her lap that she was not actually reading. She found herself, sometimes, looking at the chest and thinking not about its contents but about what would come next, what would happen when she was gone, what she still needed to do to make sure that the thing she had built would continue to function the way she wanted it to function. She had a long conversation with Pauline that February. They went over the trust documents. They went over Margaret's will, which named the trust as the residual beneficiary and which provided for various specific bequests, including a substantial bequest to Sarah, a smaller one to Helen Crockett, and modest acknowledgments to the various people in the village and beyond who had been part of Margaret's life over the years. They went over the contingency plans. What would happen if Sarah, against all expectation, decided as an adult that she did not want the cottage or the chest? They went over the contingency plans for those contingency plans. "Margaret," Pauline said, at the end of the conversation, "are you all right? You seem a little tired today." "I am tired," Margaret said. "I have been tired for some weeks. I am not sick. I have been to the doctor in Brunswick, and he says everything is what one would expect at my age. I just want to make sure that if something happens, the work is done." Pauline nodded slowly. "The work is done. The trust is sound. Sarah is named. Helen is named. The plans are all in place." "Thank you, Pauline." "Margaret, are you afraid?" Margaret thought about the question. It was a fair question. Pauline was the only person who would have known to ask it directly. Pauline had earned the right to ask it directly through 21 years of practicing law, and through 8 years of working with Margaret, and through the slow, steady accumulation of the friendship that had grown alongside the legal work. "I'm not afraid," Margaret said. "I miss Frank. I have missed Frank every day for 14 years now. I think about what it will be to see him again, if seeing is the right word for what happens after. I do not believe I will be seeing him in the way we used to see each other in our kitchen on Carver Street. But I believe there will be something. I believe my grandmother is somewhere, and my mother, and my great-grandmother, and Hollis Halsey, and Josiah Brackett, and Adelia Brackett, and Frank's parents, and my own parents. I believe I will, in some manner I do not have to understand right now, rejoin them. I am not afraid. I am only tired. There is a difference." Pauline was quiet. She nodded slowly. She did not say anything else about it, then or later. She had been raised by a Maine fisherman and a librarian, and she knew when a conversation had reached its proper end. Margaret lived 7 more years after that February conversation with Pauline. She finished the book with Felicia in the 9th year at the cottage. It was published in the 10th year. It received a careful review in a regional journal of maritime history that Margaret was not entirely sure she should have read, but that she read anyway, and the review was generous. Felicia and Margaret continued to write to each other every month, exchanging news of the small particulars of their lives in the way Margaret's great-grandparents had once exchanged letters across half the world. Sarah came up every summer. By the time she was 18, in the 11th year of Margaret's tenure at the cottage, Sarah was a young woman with strong opinions and a clear sense of what mattered to her. She had decided, that summer, to study history in college. She told Margaret, sitting at the kitchen table on the last evening of her visit, that she wanted to study history because of the cottage and the chest, and the work her grandmother had done in writing both books. Margaret listened. She did not interrupt. She thought about how strange and how lovely it was that the work she had begun at 72, with a brass key and a canvas bag, had become, by some quiet process she had not fully tracked, the influence that was now shaping the direction of an 18-year-old's life. The third book, the one Margaret began in the 12th year, was a different kind of book. It was a small book, intended for a small audience, about the women of her family across 5 generations. The book was for Sarah primarily. It was the book Margaret had been wanting to write since the first night at the cottage, when she had read the letter from her great-grandmother. But she had not been ready to write it then. She had needed the years between to gather the material. She had needed to read all of her great-grandfather's letters, and to read the further letters Helen had eventually unearthed from her grandmother's correspondence with various women in the village, and to write the first 2 books that had given her the discipline of writing. She had needed the long, quiet work of building a life at the cottage and watching the seasons pass and watching Sarah grow up. By the 12th year, she was ready. The 3rd book took her 2 years to write. It was 140 pages long when she finished it. She did not send it to a publisher. She had it bound, in a single careful copy, at a small bookbinder's shop in Portland that Caroline Harriman had recommended. The bound book was about the size of a hymnal, with a deep blue cloth cover and the title stamped in gold on the spine and the front. The title was The Women of the Cottage. She gave the book to Sarah on Sarah's 21st birthday, at the cottage, on a Saturday in June, with the apple trees behind the house in bloom and the ocean a flat gray blue under a cloudy sky. Sarah held the book in her hands. She looked at the cover. She looked at her grandmother. "Is this what I think it is?" "It is what you think it is." Sarah opened the book to the title page. The dedication, on the next page, was simple. "To Sarah, the keeper who comes next." Sarah closed the book carefully. She held it against her chest with both hands. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was steadier than Margaret had been expecting, "Thank you, Grandma. I will take care of it. I will take care of all of it." "I know you will," Margaret said. The final years at the cottage were quiet. Margaret was 84 when she finished the 3rd book. She slept more. She spent more time in the rocking chair in the front room with the chest in front of her, although she rarely opened it anymore. She had said what she needed to say about the chest in the 3 books, and the chest itself no longer required her active attention. It sat where it had always sat. It would continue to sit there after she was gone. Sarah would open it when Sarah needed to open it, and Sarah would close it again, and the chest would continue. Helen Crockett retired from the post office in the 85th year of Margaret's life and the 82nd of her own. The new postmaster was Helen's niece, a woman in her 40s named Caroline who had moved back to the village from Boston to take care of her mother. Caroline turned out to be a careful, steady person who understood, without being told, the protocols of the post office. Margaret's mail continued to be held as it had always been held. The friendship continued, although the venue shifted. Helen began coming to the cottage on Wednesday afternoons, with a tin of cookies or a jar of preserves she had made, and they would sit at the kitchen table and drink coffee and talk the way they had talked in the back room of the post office for so many years. Pauline retired in the same year. She did not stop being Margaret's lawyer, exactly, because she had set up a careful succession with a younger partner in the Brunswick firm who would take over the active management of the trust when the time came. But Pauline began coming up to the cottage more often as a friend rather than as an attorney, sometimes with her black Labrador Buster, who was old now but still managed the drive, and the 3 of them, Margaret and Pauline and Buster, would sit on the porch in the late afternoon light and watch the sky over the harbor go through its slow, gradual changes from blue to gold to pink to gray. Margaret died, as the story has already said, in the spring of her 86th year, in the bed her grandmother had died in, with the wool blanket pulled up to her chin and the ocean steady against the rocks of the point. Sarah was 28 by then. She was in graduate school in Boston, working on a doctorate in American history. She came up the morning after Margaret's death. Helen had found Margaret. Helen had been the one to come to the cottage that morning for their Wednesday coffee, and she had let herself in with the key she had been given years before, and she had found Margaret peaceful and gone in her grandmother's bed, and Helen had sat with her for an hour before she had picked up the telephone in the kitchen and called Pauline, and Pauline had called Sarah. And the chain of women who had been carrying the cottage forward had quietly and competently begun the work of carrying it forward through the death of its keeper. Sarah took possession of the cottage that summer. Donald drove her up. He had become, over the years, a man who drove his daughter places when she needed driving. He carried in her boxes. He helped her clean the small refrigerator and turn on the electricity and prime the hand pump, the way Margaret had taught him on his October visits over the past decade. He stayed for 3 days. On the last evening, he sat with Sarah on the porch and they watched the sky go through the slow changes Pauline and Margaret had watched together so many times before. "Your grandmother would be glad you're here," Donald said. "I know, Dad. She would be glad I'm here too. I think. I hope she would be." "She would be, Dad. She told me so." Donald looked at his daughter. He looked at the cottage behind her, the cedar shingles weathered to silver, the chimney straight and sound, the windows clean. He looked at the ocean. He thought about a kitchen in Hartford and a moving van and 17 brown boxes. And he thought about a brass key on a faded blue ribbon. And he thought about the 4 years he had needed to become the man he was now. The 4 years and the slow, steady patience of his mother who had let him do the work of becoming that man. And he thought about how grateful he was that he had been given the chance to do the work, because not every man who had done what he had done was given the chance. "I'm going to come up every October," he said, "the way I came up to see her. If that's all right with you." "That's all right with me, Dad. I want you to." He left the next morning. Sarah watched his car go down the dirt road, and then she went back into the cottage, and she stood in the front room in front of the chest. The brass key was in her pocket. She had been carrying it for 2 months. She took it out and looked at it. She thought about the women whose names she had memorized from the 3rd book. Adelia Brackett, who had written the letter. Adelia Halsey, who had set the table for 2 years after Hollis drowned. Lillian, her great-grandmother. Margaret, her grandmother, the most recent keeper. Sarah herself, the next. She put the key on the kitchen table beside the small wooden box that held her great-great-great-grandmother's wedding ring and the letter that had begun it all. She made herself a cup of coffee. She sat down at the table. The cottage held her in the morning light. Sarah opened the chest on her 3rd morning at the cottage. She had been waiting, not for any particular reason she could name, only because the opening had felt like something that needed its own moment, and the moment had not arrived until she had slept 3 nights in her grandmother's bed and eaten 3 breakfasts at the maple table and walked the perimeter of the property twice in the late spring sun. On the 3rd morning, she made coffee and carried the cup into the front room and knelt in front of the chest, the way she had watched her grandmother kneel 100 times across the years of her visiting, and she lifted the lid. The contents were as she remembered them. The ledgers stacked along the side. The bundle of letters tied with red ribbon. The lacquered black box, empty now, the porcelain bowl long gone to the auction house in New York. The silk shawl folded carefully in its tissue. The teak box of jewelry. The velvet pouch with its 3 remaining treasures. The brass sextant in its case. Everything where it had always been, in the same careful arrangement, waiting for the next set of hands. But on top of the ledgers, where it had not been the last time Sarah had looked into the chest 2 summers ago, there was an envelope. Cream-colored stationery. Sarah's name on the front in her grandmother's careful schoolteacher's handwriting. She lifted the envelope out. She sat back on her heels. She turned the envelope over in her hands. The flap was sealed with a small dab of red sealing wax, the kind that came from the stationery counter in the village. Margaret had taught Sarah how to use sealing wax during one of the visits, when Sarah had been 13 and had wanted to learn every old-fashioned thing the cottage contained. The seal was pressed with a small mark Sarah recognized as the imprint of the brass key. She broke the seal with her thumb. She unfolded the letter inside. "Sarah," it began, "I do not know when you will open this. I am writing it on a Tuesday afternoon in February of my 84th year. The wood stove is going. The radio is on quietly in the kitchen. Helen brought me a tin of butter cookies yesterday, and I am going to eat one when I finish this letter, because I have earned a butter cookie, and because butter cookies are one of the small pleasures I have stopped postponing. I am not going to tell you anything in this letter that I have not already told you in other ways. The book about the women of this family has the things in it that I wanted you to have in writing. The trust documents have the legal scaffolding that will let you do what you need to do without anyone being able to interfere. The cottage and the chest and the key are yours now, and you know what they are, and you know what to do with them, because you have been preparing to know what to do with them since you were 12 years old, sitting at my kitchen table eating eggs. What I want to do in this letter is much smaller. I want to give you a few practical things that did not fit in any of the other writing. The first practical thing is the stove. The wood stove needs to be cleaned twice a year, in October and in April, and Royce Coombs's son, who is now grown and has taken over the chimney work in the village, knows the cottage and will do the work properly. His name is Andrew. He is in his 30s. He does not charge much. Pay him what he asks and then a little more. The family has been doing the chimney for this cottage for 3 generations now, and the small extra is a way of saying that you noticed. The second practical thing is the apple trees behind the cottage. They are older than I am. 2 of them will eventually have to come down. The third, the one closest to the back door, has been making good apples for 90 years and may go on doing it for another 20. There is a man in the village named Bennett who knows about old trees. Call him when you are ready. He will tell you what is salvageable. The third practical thing is the hand pump. It will work for the rest of your life if you take care of it. If it ever stops working, do not let anyone replace it with anything modern. There is a man in Brunswick who restores old pumps. His name and number are in the small notebook in the kitchen drawer. The pump in this kitchen has been pumping water for 120 years, and there is no reason it should not pump for another 100. The fourth practical thing is harder to write down. I want to tell you something about the work of being the keeper. I had thought, when I first understood what the chest was and what it meant, that being the keeper would be a quiet job. It would be a matter of preserving things and passing them along. I was wrong about that, but only partly. The preserving and passing along is real. But the larger part of the work, the part one did not understand until I had been doing it for some years, is that the keeper is also the person who decides, in each generation, what the chest is for. My great-grandmother decided that the chest was for whichever woman in our line eventually needed to start over. She did not know who that woman would be. She was right to leave the question open. The woman, when she arrived, turned out to be me, but it might have been my mother, or my grandmother, or some other woman in some other branch of the family I do not know about. The chest, for my great-grandmother, was a kind of insurance. It was protection against a future she could not predict. I have made some different choices. I have used some of the contents of the chest, modestly, to start a trust that will go on after I am gone. The trust will help other women in this community who need help. The trust is not a charity. It is something more careful than that. The trust is a way of doing for other women what my great-grandmother did for me. Helen will tell you how it works in practice. Pauline will tell you how it works on paper. The 2 of them together have been running it for me, and they will run it for you for as long as either of them is able. After that, you will have to find your own Helen and your own Pauline. They are out there. The kind of women who do this work are always out there. You will recognize them when you find them. You can change any of this if you want to. The trust documents allow you to change the purposes within certain limits. You may decide, when you have been the keeper for a few years and have had time to think about it, that the chest should be for something else in your generation. You may decide that the cottage should be used differently. You may decide to write the next book in a different shape than the books I wrote. You should make those decisions yourself. Do not feel that anything I have done is binding on you. The keeper of each generation gets to decide what the chest is for in her time. I want to tell you one more thing. I was 68 when your grandfather Frank died, and 72 when I came to this cottage with a brass key and a canvas bag, and the years between those 2 ages were the worst of my life. I do not say that to make you sad. I say it because I want you to understand something about time. I had thought, at 68, that the worst years of my life were behind me. I had thought that I was in the long, winding-down portion of my life, and that there would be no more big surprises and no more big work. I was wrong. The big work of my life turned out to be the work I did between 72 and 86. The work I did in this cottage. The work I am doing right now, writing this letter to a granddaughter I love more than I can quite say, on a Tuesday afternoon in February. You will have many years when you think the big work is behind you. You may be right in some of those years. You will also be wrong in some of them. When you are wrong, the cottage will be here. The chest will be here. The key will be in your pocket. You will not have to walk for 2 hours down a county road to find your way home, the way I almost did, the way the woman in the other story did, the way so many women have had to do. You will already be home. You will already know where the home is. That is what I have been able to give you that my grandmothers could not give me, and it is the largest thing I have been able to do as the keeper of my generation. I have made sure that the next keeper knows, from the beginning, where to come. I love you. I will be watching, in whatever manner I am able to watch. Take care of the cottage. Take care of yourself. Take care of the women the trust will help. Take care of the next keeper when she eventually arrives, whether she is your daughter or your niece or some other woman in this line we cannot yet see. The chest is for her too. Grandma. Sarah folded the letter back along its creases. She held it in her lap for a long time. The cottage was very quiet around her. The morning light came in through the window of the front room at the same angle it had been coming in for 150 years, and the sound of the ocean was the same sound it had been for all of that time. And the chest was open in front of her, and the brass key was in the pocket of her cardigan. She put the letter back in its envelope. She placed the envelope inside the small wooden box on the kitchen table, the box that held her great-great-great-grandmother's wedding ring and the letter from 1931 that had begun the whole chain. The two letters belonged together now. The letter from the great-grandmother who had written for the woman she could not foresee, and the letter from the grandmother who had written for the granddaughter she had loved completely. The two letters, separated by 93 years, would stay together in the wooden box for as long as the cottage stood and the chain of women continued. Sarah closed the chest. She stood up. Her knees did not protest, because she was 28 and her knees were good. She walked into the kitchen. She poured herself a fresh cup of coffee. She sat down at the maple table that her great-great-great-great-grandfather Ezra had made in 1903, and she opened her own notebook, the one she had bought at the village stationery counter on her second day at the cottage, and she wrote, in her own handwriting, at the top of the first page, the words, "The Keeper's Notebook." Then she wrote the date. Then she began. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.